Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Stephen Shalowitz, and for over 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, connecting high school and college students to Israel, and helping our brothers and sisters in need following the heinous October 7th terrorist attack. To learn more and to see how you can contribute, do visit jnf.org. Once again, jnf.org. Plus, if you haven't done so already, we'd love it if you subscribe, rated, and reviewed us. 5 stars, of course, wherever you get your podcast. And we'd love it too if you shared the show within your orbit. Now, as for this episode, we warmly welcome Yaakov Katz to the program, the former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post and a senior fellow at the JPPI, that's the Jewish People Policy Institute. Yaakov regularly writes for Newsweek and the Jewish Chronicle. He hosts the JPPI Weekly podcast. We suggest you tune into that. It's a brilliant show and appears frequently across U.S. media platforms, including CNN. He is the author of Shadow Strike and the co-author with Amir Bobat of The Weapon Wizards. Yaakov's latest book, which he also co-authored with Bobat, is While Israel Slept, How Hamas Surprised the Most Powerful Military in the Middle East. It's a brilliantly written book published by St. Martin's Press, and I urge you to pick up a copy wherever you like to buy your books. To talk about the work and where Israel is today, 2 years on from October 7th, Yaakov joins us now on the line via Zoom from Jerusalem. Welcome back to IsraelCast, Yaakov. It's so great to see you again. And hearty congratulations on this absolutely sensational book.
Stephen, thank you so much. It's always great to be with you and to hear your voice.
Oh, right back at you. And as I mentioned to you in our email exchange, it's truly an eye-opening work. And in our time that we have, I want to hopscotch through the book, share some of the points you raised, some of the stories you included in the work, and some things that particularly caught my attention. Yet I first want to start out really, Yaakov, with, shall we say, a 30,000-foot look at the situation. So when people ask you how October 7th happened, in the broadest of brushstrokes, what do you tell them?
It's a good question, and it's a tough answer. But the answer is, I think, if I can crystallize it into one, it's that Israel believed in a fairy tale. And essentially, Israel believed that it could live alongside a genocidal terrorist group called Hamas, or for that matter, Hezbollah. It doesn't make a difference. In this case, it was Hamas that attacked on October 7th, but that it could live alongside these genocidal terrorist groups and it could deter them. It could believe, and it believed, that it could buy them off with money and it could give them economic incentives, and that once every couple of years it could fight a little skirmish or clash in a game of whack-a-mole of sorts, and that would kick the can down the road, and that it could contain the problem. It could build a big fence and an underground wall and an iron dome to swat missiles out of the sky like mosquitoes, and that it could create some sort of impenetrable reality. But when in reality what happened was that this threat only festered, the monster known as Hamas only grew, to the point that it exploded into our homes, into our bedrooms, into our military bases at 6:29 in the morning on October 7th, 2023.
And a lot of what you've just shared is encapsulated in the concept of conceptia, correct?
Exactly.
All right. And that's what Israel indeed believed. Well, I'd like you to weigh in actually on the title of the book. I have it right next to me. While Israel Slept, because on the one hand, it seemed to use the title as a metaphor, as in Israel was asleep at the wheel, and how could this have happened? Yet you also paint a very detailed picture of what went on behind the scenes while Israel was literally asleep on Friday night, October 6th, in the wee hours of the morning on Saturday, October 7th, before the attack. Did I get the dual meaning correct then, Yaakov, in terms of your selecting the title for the book? Because after I read it, I didn't so much think that Israel was asleep per se, as much as it made choices along the way, which fostered the environment for October 7th to happen.
Well, I'm definitely glad that you're picking up on the title, because you want people to think about the choice of words is often, the way we do things as writers is our tool is the language that we use. But there was a book, Stephen, that came out in the late 1940s. It was called Why England Slept, and it was actually written by JFK just as he graduated from Harvard. And there are questions of whether he actually wrote it or it was ghost written by someone else. Doesn't make a difference. But when I thought of that title and I said, should we say Why Israel Slept? I preferred the While Israel Slept because I think so much happened while we were sleeping, literally sleeping on the night between October 6th and October 7th. And Amir and I go into great detail in the book, almost blow by blow, of what was happening almost every hour from Friday night till the morning at 6:29 when the attack commenced. The flurry of activity, the alarm bells that were literally going off, blaring within intelligence headquarters, both in the IDF and in the Shin Bet, the Israel Security Agency. But what we also quickly understood when doing the research of what happened on a very tactical level, what happened in the 24, 36 hours preceding the attack, was that we discovered that something had also happened in the 35 years or so that led from Hamas's founding in the late 80s up until the attack actually started. In other words, Israel was asleep. Israel was aware, of course, that Hamas was there. It knew that Hamas had these aspirations to eliminate and to kill Israelis. It knew that it was amassing arms, but for some reason, something happened in the creation of this policy of containment that basically you called it the concepcia. So I call it the policy of containment because that's what it was. We had this policy that we believed that we could keep Hamas there, that they would not pose a threat to us over here. And everything that came in, the intelligence during the night before October 7th, different alerts or warnings in the days preceding or the months preceding and the weeks preceding the attack, even in the years, people who were warning that if Hamas does not stop, this is what would happen. It was all looked at through this prism of the concepcia or of the policy of containment. It was looked at as 1 second. Okay, we see, for example, in the middle of the night, we see that Hamas is uncovering rocket launchers. We see that Hamas is preparing underground bunkers for its top commanders. But we know that Hamas doesn't want war. We know that Hamas wants more money. We know that Hamas doesn't want to go to a fight. So everything was looked at and analyzed through this faulty prism. And I'll borrow a line from the late Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who served under George W. Bush. It wasn't a lack of information, it was a lack of imagination. And that's what Israel was suffering from. It was suffering from not understanding that what it was seeing was actually what was really happening.
You ticked off just one or two items that went on the evening of October 6th. What else would you like to share with our audience about what happened before the onslaught on October 7th, just in terms of security failure or in terms of, for example, the women that were monitoring what was going on and their reports went unheeded and so forth?
Well, I mean, I want to talk about the women for a moment who are known as the Tatzpitaniot, the surveillance soldiers, the female soldiers whose job was to sit in these bases on the front lines of the border with Gaza and literally watch screens to see what was happening. And the joke always was that if a bee flew by in their area of surveillance, they would see it because they were so acutely sensitive to any change in the terrain, to anyone who was coming there who shouldn't be there, to any movement that was out of the ordinary, to a bush that maybe moved from here to here and was supposed to be there. So if it moved now to here, maybe it means there's a tunnel underneath or a rocket launcher underneath. And they were dismissed. Their warnings in the weeks and months leading up to October 7th, they warned their commanders, we're seeing more senior Hamas field commanders coming to the border area. We're seeing more training. We're seeing more activity. We're seeing more people, things that usually they did not see. But their commanders, again, were so taken in or taken over by the concepcia that they could not see beyond it, that everything that they were told, they poo-pooed it. They shushed them. They put them away. And the fact is that these women, female soldiers, paid the ultimate price. On October 7th, take the Nahal Oz outpost, where many of them served. 15 of them were murdered by Hamas. Another 6 were taken hostage and were kidnapped, abducted away to Gaza. One of them was miraculously rescued just about a month or so into the war. But 5 of them, it took almost 500 days for them to come home. And you think about the price, and this is like a microcosm. They encapsulate the failure. They warned and were ignored. They were abandoned on the morning of October 7th by the IDF that did not get there. And then they were abandoned in Gaza for hundreds and hundreds of days until they were finally brought home in the hostage swap, earlier in 2025. But if we go back to the night of, again, Israel saw, with its different intelligence collection capabilities, the uncovering of rocket launchers. No. They saw that was happening. That would be an indication that Hamas is preparing to launch rockets. But then they intercepted a phone call between an Islamic Jihad operative and a Hamas operative. And the Islamic Jihad operative said to the Hamas operative, "What are you guys doing?" And they said, "No, it's a drill." So hold on. Is it a drill or is it an attack? They saw the preparation of the underground bunkers for top commanders, people like Mohammed Def, the leader of the Hamas military wing. But also is this part of the drill or is it part of an attack? They saw the famous story that lots of people know about by now, the SIM cards, right? About 100 phones had their SIM cards switched from the Palestinian SIM card to an Israeli SIM card just on Friday. Now, usually that would mean, so Friday, October 6th, that would mean that either suddenly you have 100 Israelis in Gaza, or you have 100 people in Gaza who are preparing to come into Israel and want to have communications, which means people are preparing to cross the border illegally. But then Israel looked back, the intelligence, and they saw, one second, they did the same time last year, smaller numbers. Maybe it's their annual oil checkup of their SIM cards, right? In other words, there were so many different indicators, but we couldn't figure out what it was that they were planning. And what Amir and I detail in the book is how through the night, the chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, is on the phone a number of times with the head of his operations directorate, with the head of the Southern Command. They're talking to the heads of the Gaza division. The head of the Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, goes in the middle of the night to his office, to headquarters in Tel Aviv, because he genuinely feels that something is wrong. He takes one of his elite Shin Bet commando squads, very small in number, sends them down to the border because something just doesn't sit right. Now, that was nothing to be able to stop the thousands of Hamas men that were about to flood into Israel. But you clearly see, Stephen, that people were not just sitting back and thinking that nothing's happening at all. They knew something was happening. And this is what makes it even more frustrating to some extent. Because when we wrote this chapter and then reread it and edited it, you want to bang your head against the wall because you realize, and it's very easy, and I recognize that we're now in the post period, so it's easy to say would have, could have, or should have. But you want to bang your head against the wall because you know that had they just taken 2 or 3 tanks that were already on the border and moved them into their position, turned on the floodlights, and said, "Hey, Hamas, we know what you're thinking. Don't you dare." Or sent down, dispatched 2, 3 Apache helicopters just to hover above the border, spinning their rodders and just throwing up dust and making it clear that anyone who comes close is going to be mowed down with the high-powered cannons that they carry under the fuselage. This might not have happened. It was that close to just making the right decision. And then you think about, and I don't want to minimize the loss of life. You think about, of course, the 1,200 people who were killed that day, the 251 people who were taken hostage by Hamas. But think about the 2 years that have passed since. 2 years of war, of trauma, of conflict. Yes, a re-engineering of the Middle East, which we could also talk about. That's part of the story now. But this is not something that I think Israel would have wanted, and it could have been avoided.
At one point in the book, and I don't have it in front of me, Yaakov, so help me with it. There was a commander in the South that sent an order to send troops. Is that correct? But it was never interpreted. It was never carried out, and I didn't understand why.
There was a commander in the South. He asked for some Air Force drones to be sent down, or helicopters even. And for some reason, it got lost in the chain of command and it was never fulfilled. There's all these stories of random things that happened in the right way. Like, for example, someone in the Southern Command decided to update the commander of the Ashdod Navy base. Let him know that, there's something going on. We're not sure what it is. And that naval commander, just out of his own decision, decided to send another ship out to patrol that night. Now, we all know that Hamas sent a bunch of ships, commandos, to come from Gaza to the Zikim beach, which is just basically cutting across the border and coming straight into Israel. There were a number of ships because we had more than one vessel out there. Israel, the Navy, was able to intercept most of those Hamas ships. Some of them still made to shore and massacred people on the shore, but it would have been so much more. So you saw that it was really a very ad hoc decision. There was never a command that was brought down by the chief of staff, by the head of the Southern Command, by the operations directorate. Be on heightened alert. Beef up your forces, get people on the border, stand on the border, show them that we're there. On the contrary, Stephen, the decision was get a little ready, do some things, but make sure they don't see anything that you're doing. And the reason was, and again, I don't want to be judgmental because it's very difficult to be in those positions and it's hard to blame them. They were working with the information that they had. They were victims, as we all were, by the way, to the concepcia, to this fairy tale. But the reason that they didn't want Hamas to see what they were doing was because if Hamas knew that we knew that they were preparing for something, and then it turned out to be nothing, it turned out to be a drill, Hamas would do some reverse engineering and figure out, how does Israel know that we're doing something? How did Israel know that we're planning a drill? And then intelligence sources would be jeopardized. So the IDF, to some extent, and it's terrible to say, was more concerned about burning sources than it was concerned about what eventually would happen.
And interestingly, as you point out in the book, Israel neglected recruiting and placing human assets on the ground in Gaza. And there really was no human intelligence there. And I'm just wondering if, as we speak today, that's changed. I'm guessing so.
No, it's definitely changed. It's changed dramatically. But we have to go back for a moment and look at Israel's entire approach to the Gaza Strip in the run-up to October 7th. Right? The policy of containment had in my opinion, had three primary legs to it. Leg number one was technology. Now, technology splits into two different categories. Category number one is defense. We had the Iron Dome. So when Hamas would fire rockets, they bothered us, they were annoying, but they didn't pose a dramatic threat to the state of Israel. They weren't something that would force Israel to have to send its troops into Gaza, to have to go to a war, for example, because Iron Dome had a 90% success rate of interception. So they could fire rockets, short range, longer range. They could fire towards Jerusalem, towards Tel Aviv, whatever it might be, and we would intercept them. So therefore, that was believed to be contained. Take you to 2014 during Operation Protective Edge, a 50-day operation in the summer of that year, when Hamas started popping out of tunnels inside Israel and tragically killed a number of Israeli soldiers. 2 soldiers at the end of that war were actually kidnapped their bodies were taken by Hamas, Oron Shaul and Hadar Golden. Oron Shaul's body was recovered about 6 or 8 months ago. Hadar Golden's body remains, as we record this, still in the Gaza Strip, being held by Hamas since 2014. But when the Hamas guys started popping out of the tunnels, Israel realized it had to do something else. It wasn't enough. So what did it do? It does what it always did. It dug down to the aquifer and it dug a wall. It dug the iron wall to stop the Hamas tunnels. Then it did another thing. It built a system, very classified, highly sophisticated. It brought the brightest minds that it has in Israel and in the industry, in universities, in R&D, and in the military. And they came up with a system that can detect when a tunnel is being dug along the border, where it's being dug, and even what tool it is being used to be dug. It was so impressive that we pretty much stopped the terror tunnels. But then ask yourself, how many people crossed into Israel on October 7th in a tunnel? And the answer is zero. So we had the technology, category one. Category two of the technology was, we said, we're so in control of Gaza. We know everything that's happening. We have drones all the time above. We have satellites. We have sensors. We have cameras. We have radars. We have this impenetrable fence. And we also can listen to all of their communications. We don't need human agents. We don't need human informants. We know everything before they even think it because we're listening to them. That turned out to be a tragic mistake because you have to ask yourself, you had thousands of people who eventually crossed into Israel. You had hundreds who knew that this was happening as it was happening. Not one could call their Israeli handler and say, hey, we're coming. Take a 5-minute warning update. Nothing. There was nobody there. That has been worked on a lot in the 2 years since October 7th. There's a unit in the IDF that we talk about, part of military intelligence, called 504 in Hebrew, 504th unit of military intelligence. Very elite, very secretive. They manage and operate human agents across enemy lines. Their entire focus in the years leading up to October 7th was Lebanon and Syria. Since October 7th, they've been very much focused on what happens also in Gaza. And listen, I mean, we need that. By the way, it's not something that is unique to Israel. Intelligence agencies around the world, with the sophistication of technology and the advance that has been made and progress, really, there's unbelievable things today. You can literally think with technology, I know what you're thinking before you even think it. A lot of intelligence agencies started to say, what do I need the risk and the cost of running a human agent? It costs money, that puts people's lives on the line. I can just listen to them. But what we've learned is you might be able to think you know what they're thinking and know what they're saying, but you don't really know. And that was the price of that failure.
Yaakov, let's say one other point on October 7th as such, before we move on to other points that you raised in the book. You pointed out that there was a meeting 3 weeks before the war, before October 7th, that Ronen Bar, the head of the Shin Bet, had to talk about a preemptive strike in Gaza. And then on the 1st of October, he met with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And then the follow-up meeting was supposed to happen when? The 8th of October, which clearly it never happened. And I'm just wondering if you can share any thoughts about whether or not you even think, in the land of what if, that preemptive strike, do you think it could have gone through, or would it have been nixed by the prime minister again because of this whole approach to containment of Hamas?
Look, it's difficult to know 100%. I mean, what you're touching on also is another argument that you often hear, where the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his supporters say, I mean, what do you want from Bibi? He was sleeping and no one woke him up. Had you woken him up, maybe things would have played out differently. I think my opinion on that is, I don't know, number one. But number two is that until that point in time, Netanyahu had numerous opportunities to try to take on Hamas in a bigger way, to try to topple Hamas, to try to bring it down, and he refused to do so. He refused to do it even though he promised he would back when he was reelected as prime minister in 2009. He was afraid to send the ground troops into Gaza. He was afraid even after October 7th, and he hesitated for a while, and we talk about that also in the book. But the general, again, assessment in Israel, which was shared literally by everyone. And I really feel that this was a failure that we all own a piece of in Israel, from the political echelon to the top military command, to the intelligence officials, and even to people like myself, journalists who were in those briefings with these top officials in the military, in intelligence, in the government, and didn't ask maybe the right questions, didn't push hard back against the concepcia that we were also being told. I mean, I remember, Stephen, being in a briefing with the chief of staff a few months before October 7th. The whole briefing was about Iran, Hezbollah, US-Israel relations, the West Bank, advancements in technology, different weapon systems. Barely any word was said about what was happening in the Gaza Strip. It was pretty much Hamas is deterred. They want economic prosperity. Don't worry, everything's okay. Let's move on. Maybe we should have pushed harder to try to shatter that belief that so many people held on to. And therefore, I think that ultimately the idea, the possibility of preemptive action was never going to happen because we also have to remember something very basic. Israel's national defense doctrine for decades has been not to launch a preemptive strike because of a conventional military threat. The one exception is potentially the 1967 Six-Day War, when even there's a disagreement, a machloket, as we call it, between historians of whether it was already clear that war was happening, and therefore when Israel launched its attack against the air forces of Egypt and Syria, it was already okay. But besides for that, Israel only launched preemptive strikes against nuclear capabilities. Iraq in 81, Syria in 2007. It watched as Hezbollah amassed 150,000 rockets and missiles. It watched as Hamas did the same. It never wanted to be the one to initiate that conflict. And therefore, I think that Israel was going to stick with that. What I'm happy to see that has changed since the war is that we no longer hold by that policy. We actually now hold by a preemptive policy.
Yeah, and in your conclusions, you talk about the fact that Israel should move towards a preemptive policy. But we're going to talk about targeted strikes in just a second. But when it comes to preemptive strikes, there were cases where Israel could have gone after Sinwar and others, but for a whole host of reasons didn't. Like in 2022, you point out that Naftali Bennett was prime minister then. The IDF chief said to him, please convince me why we should go in, because you'll have to convince me that it's worth the war. And then Bennett was thinking of his coalition and ultimately said no. So there were opportunities, clearly, as you point out in the book, to go after Sinwar and to go after other Hamas leaders and indeed, to root out Hamas in Gaza. Let's turn to Hamas, though, for the moment. And then if we have time at the end, there's 12,000 things I want to ask Yaakov Katz, dear audience. I took a million notes here, and the whole book is completely underlined. You have to get a copy and read it 5 times because there's just so much in it, and it's absolutely fascinating. There is something that I want to ask you about later on. It's a bit of a tease. Jericho Walls of 2022, and that report. Yeah. So let's leave that for the very end. So we'll have to leave some time for that. But I want to move on to Hamas because I think our audience would find it very interesting to know, and if you can share the antecedents of the organization, Mujama al-Islamiyah, that Sheikh Yassin started back in 1973. And then if you can dovetail your comments there into the establishment of the Islamic University of Gaza in 1978, and how both were, let's say, turning points, really, for Israel's relations with what was going on in Gaza.
Look, Hamas was not created in a single day, right? And just like, by the way, the policy of containment was not invented in a single day. It incubated. It took time till we reached this point of where we believed, for example, that you could buy off a terrorist organization. But back in the 1970s, Israel was in control of the Gaza Strip. This is after the Six-Day War. Israel conquers Gaza, takes it from the Egyptians, and we're in control. We're running the place in place of the Egyptians. Military governor and a military command down there. And everything that wants to be established in Gaza needs to get the approval and the permit of the Israeli commanders. For example, Sheikh Yassin, as you mentioned, that's the paraplegic, almost blind, wheelchair-bound cleric Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who was the spiritual and founding father terrorist of Hamas, eventually killed in 2003 or 2004 in an Israeli airstrike. He comes to the Israeli authorities and he says, I want to establish an Islamic association called the Mujama al-Islamiyah. And Israel gives him the approval. And he says, what I want to do with this is basically create welfare institutions. I want to create religious institutions. I want to teach the children of Gaza Islam. I want to create and build the Islamic University of Gaza, which is basically the place where many of the Hamas commanders came up. You have Ismail Haniya, Sinwar, Muhammad Def. They all went there. They all went to
The
this one
Harvard of
university.
Gaza, isn't it?
Well, the Harvard of terrorism is definitely the way to look at it. And the Mujama gets going, and for the beginning, things seem okay. But then in the late 80s, suddenly there's tension in Gaza. And it's after the first Intifada. It's still not known as Hamas. But then suddenly Israel discovers that this new entity has been created. And it quickly discovers that these are all followers of Sheikh Yassin. And these are all people who went through the Mujama, who went through his Islamic association, and many who went to the university. Many were student leaders there. Ismail Haniya, who was eventually killed during this war in a Mossad attack, a targeted killing in a guest house in Tehran that he was visiting, he was the student union leader at the Islamic University, later became the assistant to Sheikh Yassin, and then became the prime minister of Hamas of Gaza, and then the leader of Hamas all over the world. These were not good people. But what Israel saw to some extent, and this was one of those signs that we looked for to understand how this happened, Israel found in the late 80s weapons in the hands of different disciples of Sheikh Yassin and members of the Mujama. But when it looked at what the weapons were being used for, it said, one second, they're not being used against us. This is the Islamists who want to fight against the secularists, Fatah, the PLO. Who was Israel's enemy at the time? The PLO. So we believed in this idea that as long as the weapons, yeah, they're there, but they're being used against the bad guys who are really the bad guys, it's not our problem. We turned a blind eye.
Well, it's a question of my enemy's enemy is my friend.
Correct. By the way, I mean, I'll fast forward to one of the startling revelations that came out in the last few months in the management of the war in Gaza, is that Israel is arming different militias in Gaza, in the southern part of Gaza. The Abu Shabab militia is giving them support because they're fighting against Hamas. Now, again, I saw that and I said, how could we be going down and making the same mistake that we made 30 years ago, more once again? How do we believe that this makes sense, that some militia is going to solve our problems for us? It's ridiculous. And therefore, it's sometimes you are narrow-sighted and narrow-minded, and you're looking at the quick resolution to a problem as opposed to the long-term issue that will fester if not really dealt with.
So the Hamas charter, as you point out, is akin to a religious document. And in it, it calls for no recognition and engaging in political negotiations with Israel. It's all off the table. Yet they are now. And so do you think that that's just a front? Is it just a foil? And to what extent does the West not understand that their charter is a religious document? It's for them, it's an affront that Jews are in that land. And it seems that once again, the West mistakenly looks at the Middle East through a Western liberal, small L, lens. And so can you weigh in on that, Yaakov?
Look, I mean, this is part of the problem, but it's hard for me. I could easily judge and say the world turns a blind eye. The world doesn't want to see what's happening before its own eyes. The world doesn't want to see the truth. And the truth is that there's a terrorist organization that uses some of the worst anti-Semitic language, that literally is copying language from Mein Kampf and others, and wants to destroy and eliminate the Jewish people. One of the problems, Stephen, I think that people around the world often have is that they think that, like, Iran, for example, is an Israeli problem, right? But what they forget is that when the Ayatollahs march through the streets of Tehran and chant death to Israel in the same breath, they're chanting also death to the United States of America. These are not problems that belong just to Israel. But instead of going down that road, so you'll excuse me, of saying, look, the West is blind and the West needs to open up their eyes and needs to understand what's really happening, it's also incumbent on Israel. I mean, we knew about this charter. We saw it, right? We had copies of it back in the 1980s. We saw what was happening. I spoke with the military commanders who were there on the ground in Gaza, who got their hands on those first initial copies of the charter, read through it, were horrified and shocked, but no one really did anything. And that's the question that I ask myself is how did we believe that this document wasn't something that was going to inspire, incite, and radicalize to such an extent, literally millions of people?
And the one thing that kept popping up for me was that, as you point out, like Prime Minister Netanyahu in his memoir, Bibi, said that he had bigger fish to fry, Hezbollah in Iran. And that notion of bigger fish to fry really kept popping up in the book. But then I was thinking to myself, Yaakov, can't Israel walk and chew gum at the same time? Or is it a case of there are only limited resources and you have to focus on what is the issue that is the most burning issue at the moment?
I mean, Israel can walk and chew gum at the same time, but it can't chew a lot of pieces of gum at the same time. The Netanyahu was wrong and
I
he
have
was
to
right.
almost apologize for asking that question because I don't live in Israel. I did not serve in the IDF, but I'm just saying.
No, it's a perfect.
But
It's
I'm
a
saying
it's
that in
an
part because I have the greatest of admiration for Israel and it's for its intelligence, for the IDF, et cetera, because what they have accomplished is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, when you think of the pager situation, and when you think of those targeted strikes in Iran, for example, I mean, it's like out of a spy movie. So
yeah.
that's the thing. That was the frustrating part for me is I
But
was
that's exactly the point, Stephen. And I think those examples, what we saw with the pager attack against Hezbollah, which is the stuff out of Hollywood movies, it's legendary. When we saw the attack in the 12-day war against Iran, the decimation of its nuclear scientists, the elimination of its top military command, the destruction to its and damage to its nuclear uranium enrichment facilities. We said, wow, look at what Israel's capable of doing. And Israel's capable of doing great things. But it's capable of doing those great things when it prioritizes and when it is focused and when it understands the threat before it. So it understood Iran. It understood Hezbollah. What it did not understand was Hamas. And, speaking to a lot of these security cabinet members over the last couple of years and top military commanders as well, one of the themes that I often hear from people is we did not appreciate what Hamas was capable of doing. We did not understand that this was something that can happen. And there's a lot of pieces to it once again. There's the technology. There's the fact that we felt impenetrable. There's the bigger fish to fry. We have limited resources. We can't do everything always everywhere. So we have to focus, like Bibi wrote in his book, we have to focus on Iran. We have to focus on the 150,000 rockets and missiles that Hezbollah has that we were being told by the military and political leadership in this country that if they unleash that, it will devastate the state of Israel. So that seemed like the bigger threat. And Hamas was lower down on the totem pole.
There's limited resources. By the way, one thing to give Israel a shout out about, when you look at countries with a comparable population size, do those other countries have the same brain power? And are they able to achieve everything that Israel has achieved? And for me, the answer is no. Because, throughout the book, you talk about this elite group, that elite group, this elite group. And I got so lost with the number of elite groups that there are in the IDF and the Shin Bet, Mossad, et cetera. And it's really remarkable when you think about it, how much brain power there is in this tiny country with a very tiny population. So just saying, we got to give Israel a shout out for that. But I think what I'm hearing from you, it's a question of prioritization. Well, listen, I think people should buy the book While Israel Slept, if for no other reason, to understand, again, Hamas better, but also your chapter on targeted killings. I just hinted at it a moment ago. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. And for those who say Israel is indiscriminately killing people and committing genocide, I want you to weigh in on that. It's so worthwhile reading that chapter on targeted killings to show the care that Israel has taken and took in rooting out terrorists. And there were cases where Israel could have gone after, as I said, Sinwar, but Naftali Bennett said no. But there was an attack on the Abu Ras house. And I want you to share that story because that to me really talks about the care that the IDF took and continues to take, not to kill civilians, but to go after terrorists?
So this goes back to 2003. And to tell the story of 2003, we do have to make one mention of what happened in 2002. In 2002, there was a top Hamas commander in Gaza. His name was Saleh Shehadeh. Was behind really some of the most ruthless suicide terrorist bombings. This is 2002. Remember, the Second Intifada broke out in 2000. Israel's losing dozens of people every month. There was the Black March of 2002 when a couple hundred people were killed in 1 month. The famous Park Hotel bombing in Netanya on the night of the Seder, when a terrorist disguised as a woman walked into the hotel, blew himself up, killed 30 people. Israel was at war. The country was paralyzed, terrified to go on a bus, to go sit in a coffee shop or a restaurant. And Israel's at war and trying to eliminate and pinpoint and kill these terrorists. And so in 2002, it finally gets information of where Saleh Shehadeh is hiding. And they drop a 1-ton bomb on a building. And they thought that the collateral damage, and I hate to use that term, but that the term for the civilians who were with him, would be minimal. Unfortunately, about 14 or 15 other people were killed. And the world came crashing down on Israel. How could you kill so many innocent civilians just to kill one other person? Now, fast forward just under a year later to the summer of 2003. I think it was July of 2003. And Israel gets intelligence that all of the Hamas leaders, Sheikh Yassin, Ismail Haniyeh, all of the guys are gathering together in this house, in the Abu Ras house in Gaza. At first, they don't believe that it's even going to happen, because this is like, imagine bin Laden, Zarqawi, all the top Al-Qaeda guys coming together into one place. And you know about this meeting. So first they're scouting out, they're trying to figure out where they're going to meet. And eventually they hone in on this one building, the Abu Ras home. It's a 3-story building in Gaza. And they watch them literally. They're tracking each of these Hamas members, and they see them come to the house and they see them go inside. And it's obvious. I mean, something has to be done, right? We have to kill these people. They're all there. I mean, this is the blow to decapitate the entire leadership of Hamas at once in one single blow. But then Israel starts to have, at the top military and intelligence levels, where are they in the building? Are they on the first floor? Are they on the second floor? Or are they on the third floor? Now, they don't know. So they say, one second, they can't be on the second floor for whatever reason. They think they might be on the first floor. But then they don't think they're on the first floor. They call off the operation because they say, we don't know where they are. And then someone comes up with some idea that because the curtains are drawn on the third floor, they must be on the third floor. Now, they had options. They could have dropped a 1-ton bomb and destroyed the entire building. But the problem was that in the buildings in the vicinity, it was already the afternoon. Kids were home from school. There would have been a lot of civilian casualties. They decide they're not going to do that. But because they thought they were on the third floor, they said, we'll drop a 1/4-ton bomb just into the third floor, which they ended up doing. And you know what happened? They were all on the first floor. And they all got away, and not a single one was killed that day. And Amir and I tell these stories in the book because it's one of those events that you look back and you say, was that the right move? Was that the wrong move? Now, I understand the logic behind it. Israel had been traumatized by what had happened in the Shehadeh bombing a year earlier, when 14, 15 people were killed, and the world came crashing down on Israel. It appointed a commission of inquiry. It got to the Supreme Court. The president of the United States, Bush, was all upset at Israel. The whole world was upset at Israel. So it went from almost no caution in 2002 to being overcautious in 2003. And that's kind of, if you trace back in time, that's kind of how it evolved, and our war against Hamas evolved. We became very accurate, very precise. We knew how to put a missile through a window onto a bed to kill the terrorist. And we were very proud of that. It was the most moral way to fight. We were doing things that no other military ever did. We were calling up people, leave the homes, leave the buildings. We dropped leaflets. We send text messages to terrorists to get out of the building before we destroy it. No other military in the world does that. But did that deal with the enemy? Did that solve the problem? No, it did not. And again, we're getting into a philosophical conversation almost, because the question becomes, well, shouldn't we be right morally, even if we're wrong policy-wise? I don't know. I don't know that there's a really good answer to that question.
So I just raised the question, is there a genocide going on in Gaza?
No. And Stephen, it's one of the absurdities of this war, of the lies and the fabrications that I'll say even more, it's perverted, that this lie is even spread by people who you would think are intelligent and understand. I mean, first of all, let's just look at the dry facts, okay? Israel drops millions of leaflets. Israel makes hundreds of thousands of robocalls. Israel actively works to remove civilians out of areas where it operates so it can go in there in the most sterile conditions possible in an urban war setting, which is never going to be possible 100%, to get the civilians out of the way. No other military has done this ever in any other conflict. Now, compound that with the fact that Hamas intentionally, purposely wants its civilians of Gaza to be killed. This is why it embeds itself in civilian infrastructure, why it puts its rocket launchers in hospitals and mosques and in schools and in apartment buildings, why it sets up command centers in those hospitals and in those schools. It does all of this because it wants Israel to kill those people. That's what this is about. So the question is not our innocent people being killed, because tragically, and it is tragic, they have been killed in this war in big numbers. But the question is, who's to blame and why were they killed? And I think the blame and the responsibility is on Hamas. But I want to say one other thing. Another one of the crazy realities that's come out of this war is how the Gaza Health Ministry, the so-called Gaza Health Ministry, is just quoted all the time in the mainstream media. Now, let's remember, this is the Hamas Health Ministry. It would be like the New York Times or CNN quoting the Al-Qaeda Health Ministry or the ISIS Health Ministry. No one would ever do that. But for some reason, when it comes to the Gaza Health Ministry, they quote it, and it's as if it's gospel from God. Now, I say something simple. They talk about 62, 63,000 people killed. It's horrific. So many people have been killed. There's no reason that I should accept their number, but I'll say, I'll take their number. I'll accept it. But I ask for one thing in return. Take the Israeli number, because they don't make any distinction between combatants and civilians. And as we heard from the Prime Minister recently at the United Nations, you have about 20,000 combatants who have been killed in this war. Now, in every war, there's something called the combatant-civilian ratio. For every combatant, how many civilians are killed? And I know this sounds cold and, numbers. We're talking about lives that have been lost. And again, every loss of civilian life is a great tragedy. But let's look at the numbers. 60,000, 20,000. That means that for every combatant, 2 civilians have been killed. And if I want to say it's worse than that, it's 3 civilians that have been killed. Now go to the United Nations, Stephen, and ask them, what's the average in conflicts over the last 100 years? Or even take out World War II. Just look at Afghanistan and Iraq. We're talking about 1 to 6, 1 to 9. So instead of accusing the IDF of genocide, maybe people should be applauding the IDF for really fighting in a way that no other military has ever fought. Definitely not in an urban setting as densely populated like this, and where the enemy uses the civilian infrastructure to be able to launch its attacks.
I'm so glad that you clarified that, really, for our dear audience around the world, because, Yaakov, we have listeners in countries with which Israel doesn't even have diplomatic ties, and God knows what kind of media they're getting and what kind of information they're getting. But of course, here in the United States, we also get disinformation about the war as well. And you just cited, dare I say, CNN, which is just one of the networks that yours truly. I actually used to work for CNN. I was an intern many a moon ago, so I can be critical of my former employee. Listen, I am so super mindful of your time in the clock. Just on a personal level, first of all, where were you on October 7th?
I was home in Jerusalem. It was Simchat Torah. It was a holiday. It was a Shabbat morning. We had been to my in-laws who live in the old city of Jerusalem the night before, celebrating, had the Chag meal, the holiday meal at their house. Had maybe a bit too much to drink. We walked home. We don't live in the old city. We walked back to our house, went to sleep, and we woke up at 8:30 in the morning with the siren that was going off in Jerusalem. And that was one of the rockets that had been fired towards Jerusalem. We would go down to the bomb shelter and come back upstairs, look at my phone, turn on the television, and see right away. I'll never forget the image, already just 2 hours into this, of those white pickup trucks with Hamas men on the streets of Sderot. And I remember turning to my wife and saying, this is something else. This is not something that should be happening. It's obvious to everyone. Later that day, had to drive our daughter, who was then training to become an officer in the IDF. She then became an officer, but she was then in training, to the bus that would take her essentially to the war, as all the soldiers were being called back to base. And that was a tough moment as a parent driving your child to know that they're going off. And even if I knew my daughter would not be on those front lines of soldiers going into Gaza, but to know that you're sending your child to a war is something that does stay with you for a long time. I think one of the parts of this war that has often been missed by people around the world, Stephen, if I could, is that this war touched every Israeli. There's not a single Israeli who didn't know someone killed on October 7th, taken hostage on October 7th, killed in the fighting since. I look at my own family, my own 4 kids. They've lost friends from youth groups, husbands of teachers, people from day one. We knew 2 of the hostages. One had served in the army with my younger brother. One was the son of members of a synagogue that we would go to in Jerusalem. This was something that hit every single Israeli in the gut, in their hearts. They knew people. This wasn't some attack somewhere else. This was an attack on each and every one of us. And that trauma is still very alive, I think, for Israelis. And it's why it's so important that the only way this war can really end is with the hostages coming home, with the war ending in a way that brings those hostages home. Whatever the political horizon is, we will not be able to heal as a nation without that, first and foremost.
Right. Yaakov, this has been such a fascinating conversation, and I have 12 million more questions that I wanted to ask you. And of course, I wanted to talk about the Jericho walls as well. I'd love to do a part 2 with you, maybe in another month or two, because we're recording this for you, our dear audience, on September 29th, 2025. The episode will be released in a couple of weeks, and we can only hope and pray that the hostages will be released by then. And so I would love to do just sort of a round 2 to get to more about the book and then kind of where Israel is at this moment, if you're game for that, Yaakov.
100%, anytime.
Oh, right. And we appreciate that indeed. Once again, the book is While Israel Slept, How Hamas Surprised the Most Powerful Military in the Middle East. It's published, as I said at the top of the show, by St. Martin's Press. And of course, the authors are Yaakov Katz and Amir Bobat. And we want to thank you once again, Yaakov, for joining us here on this episode of IsraelCast. And we'll indeed have info about Yaakov and the book on the show notes page of this very episode on our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And as for IsraelCast, we do release new episodes of the show every other Wednesday. This one's going to go up on a Thursday right after Simchat Torah, just saying. And just so you never miss an episode, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Simply search for IsraelCast. Don't forget to rate and review us 5 stars, of course, because that really makes it easier for more folks around the world to find us. You can always enjoy the show, too, by visiting us at our website. Once again, it's jnf.org/IsraelCast. And indeed, it takes a whole moshav to put IsraelCast together. For that, we thank Vivian Grossman, Stefan Oberman, and Jessica Menton. Our editor is the absolutely fantastic Jay Rothman. And the music that you hear at the top and tail of the program is titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. For more info about JNF USA, do visit jnf.org. Once again, jnf.org. Do visit. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say howdy, I know Yaakov would love to hear from you, wouldn't you, Yaakov?
Definitely.
And so would I. So do email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Stephen Shalowitz. Thank you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.